Today's episode is a free preview of our sister podcast, To Save Us from Hell. This is the only independent podcast about the United Nations. Co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I are bona fide UN experts. I've covered the UN as a journalist for nearly 20 years. Anjali is a professor of international relations at Fordham University who teaches and researches and studies the UN. And with our powers combined, we bring you insights and analysis about all things United Nations that you simply can't find elsewhere. Full episodes of To Save Us from Hell are available exclusively to paying subscribers. You can get a subscription via globaldispatches.org following the links in the show notes of this episode, or if you're listening directly in Apple Podcasts, you can unlock a subscription in-app. What we're doing with this show is truly unique, and I hope that you will help us keep this show alive and sustain our coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode. Hopefully we're still doing this show a year from now. You and I could be talking about $3 billion in arrears at the UN.
Yes.
Which is its total operating budget. Welcome to Save Us from Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm a journalist. I cover the United Nations. I run Global Dispatches, which houses this very podcast.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York. And I teach and I do research and I write about the United Nations.
And I have to imagine, Anjali, we are recording this in December. Mm-hmm. It's got to be finals era for you. How's that going for you?
Today is the last day of classes.
Ooh, congratulations, I suppose.
I thank you. Yes, it is Sagittarius season, the season of more energy than sense. And I have this ongoing conversation with my lovely colleague, Anna Ola at Brooklyn College, where at the end of every semester, we always say, what dingus assigned all of this work? And it is always us somehow. It's always you. You always end up reaping what you assigned.
It's funny, for me as a journalist, having done this for so long, there's like rhythms of the year.
Yeah.
And like December is like a slower part of the year. But I am a mere journalist. You are an academic ensconced in an institution. Are you a tough grader?
No. I have a explicitly relaxed approach to grading. We have this policy in my classes that we are generous with people and tough on ideas.
Oh, that's nice. I like that.
Yeah. So, that doesn't mean that we don't rigorously engage with the ideas that we are writing about or reading about. It just means that I'm not that fussed about the grade. I TA'd for many years for Father Matthew Carnes at Georgetown, and he used to say that the lower end of a distribution will always take care of itself in ways that require nothing from you.
Oh, good. Let the universe conspire.
Well, it's one of those things where you really don't need to run around looking for reasons to grade people badly. You know what I mean? Like, that's just it's not a way I spend my time. So,
what classes are you teaching next semester?
I am teaching a class on the United Nations.
Ooh, like you do every other week here on this very podcast.
I teach it every spring. It's a big lecture in international relations. I am teaching a seminar on the Security Council and its role in international law and peace and security, an advanced seminar. And then I am teaching Introduction to International Relations, which I have taught almost every semester for 10 years.
That's so funny. I, as a grad student, took that Introduction to International Relations class. And I've said this to people over the years that at the time, I kind of rolled my eyes at all of the big theories that you are supposed to learn. Because I was a working journalist at the time. I was doing my thing, writing UN Dispatch, reporting on international issues. And I didn't really have time or patience for the big theories. But the longer that I've been doing this, the more important and crucial those big theories have become and have revealed themselves to be. So, there's a reason the classics are the classics, I suppose.
They are. And I like to tell my students that it's a sort of reflexively constructivist class, which is to say that we think of the big theories as the assumptions people hold when they make policy or think about the world. And we got to understand those assumptions to understand how people interpret the world around them and then decide on action. So they're not just ivory tower constructs. You see them pop up all over the place.
So you mentioned that you are teaching class on the Security
Mhm.
Council and the Security Council's role in international affairs. Well, here in our first free segment for you listeners, we are going to discuss that very topic. So we are recording our conversation on Wednesday, December 3rd, and it's about a quarter to midnight in Damascus right now, where on December 4th, the Security Council, all 15 members, will set foot for the first time as a Security Council on an official trip. This is truly a remarkable development when you think about where we were just a year ago. And particularly if you think about where we were 10 years ago, which I know you and I will talk about in a moment. But, these trips are not an easy thing to schedule or to hold. The itinerary itself requires the consent of all 15 members. So, like, who you're going to meet, what topics you will cover, everyone needs to agree on ahead of time. You don't want to have a situation where one delegate like walks out of the room because their government can't meet with so and so. But, here we are, and it's just about a year to the day of the anniversary of the fall of the Assad regime when Assad fled to Moscow. And the new regime in charge, al-Shara, is taking, I think, meaningful steps towards a democratic transition. I mean, we'll see how things emerge over the course of the next year. But so far, al-Shara has taken, I think, significant and important steps towards a meaningful democratic transition in Syria. A lot to go. But nonetheless, as I said, it is remarkable that on December 4th, the Security Council will set foot in Syria, in Damascus, for the first time ever.
First, I just want to note that there is a substantial amount of violence on the ground still in Syria
Yes.
that people are experiencing across the country. In that context, it becomes, I think, particularly notable that the Security Council is showing up there. We know, that this is in part a notable trip because al-Shara was designated a terrorist by the UN Security Council even after the fall of the Assad regime. It was only recently that the council worked together to adopt a resolution that would help him visit Donald Trump at the White House. And so this is a pretty notable trip by them amidst some ongoing violence because it basically, in part, bespeaks their hope and confidence in the transition. It's been a year, the fall of the Assad regime finally a year ago was, I think, a moment of pretty substantial relief for the council. I mean, obviously, of course, for Syrians, but Syria has been the source of a lot of strife at the Security Council for the last decade. So, in addition to having finally toppled the Assad regime, the current sort of government of Syria also resolved a fundamental problem that the Security Council had been wrestling with for the last decade. So they're showing up there now. The trip is being led by the Slovenian delegation because Slovenia has the rotating presidency of the Security Council this month. And it's also notable that Slovenia has been one of the group of states, largely elected members, Slovenia, Ireland, Jordan, Mexico, right, that have done the bulk of the work of the Security Council for the last decade on Syria. As there's been strife between the P5, these rotating members, these elected members, have stepped up to try and broker the humanitarian dimensions of Security Council agreement on Syria. So I think it is notable that the Security Council is going. It bespeaks a kind of hope and confidence in the transition. It is also notable that the delegation will be led by an elected member in a conflict where elected members took the lead after there was deep division between the US and Russia. And it is also notable that they're arriving at a time when the UN's role in the region is up in the air.
So let's unpack all of that because I would argue, and I will argue, that the kind of paralysis that we see at the Security Council today on so many key issues on international peace and security, on Ukraine, on Gaza, and more, really has its roots in its modern form in the Syria crisis and conflict. In 2011, as the civil war in Syria erupted and the Assad regime started brutally suppressing what were initially democratic protests and peaceful protests, the Russians quickly sided with Assad. And as Assad's brutality became more and more apparent to the rest of the world, the Western countries on the P5, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom sided firmly against Assad. And it was really that fracture at the Security Council that got deeper and deeper and deeper as the conflict in Syria drew on, that created this massive geopolitical rift at the Security Council that we see today. And, I would remember watching Security Council sessions in which Samantha Power would like berate her Russian counterpart. Her Russian counterpart would berate Samantha Power all over Syria. And it really was Syria that drove the wedge in the Security Council that we see today, which makes this trip all the more remarkable.
That is definitely the case. I will also say it's hard to know whether it was substantively the Syrian civil war or whether it was essentially that there was always going to be this fracture on core irreconcilable differences between Russia and the US, the UK, and France. It just was a question of when that fracture line would arise, and it happened to arise in the form of the Syrian civil war, which very quickly became an internationalized civil war, and which for many years, I think, sort of defied clear explanation in terms of the commitment that the Russian government had to the Syrian regime for many people. But nonetheless, so this fracture line emerges. And we also see, I think, the sort of emergence of other counter trends at the Security Council through the sort of inability to arrive at decisions around Syria. This is a situation where what we see is repeated vetoes from Russia on the Syrian case, essentially foiling all kinds of multilateral action, collectively popular multilateral action. And we see a couple of trends emerge in reaction to this gridlock, I think. The first I've already mentioned is the way in which the elected members of the Security Council start to work on humanitarian resolutions, start to work to sort of separate the humanitarian and the political portfolios of a particular case and to say, okay, maybe we won't make progress in the political portfolio, but we must make progress on the humanitarian portfolio. In the Syrian case, we see that in the negotiation of 5 cross-border passages for aid, which eventually, by the end of the war, was restricted down to 1, right? A single cross-border crossing for aid into northwest Syria.
It's worth maybe just unpacking that a little bit. As you said, with the P5 kind of stuck on their political disagreements on Syria, the elected members went forward and tried to put forward some like just purely humanitarian resolutions in place, and they were successful to a certain degree in the early teens. And one of the ways in which they were successful was to create this kind of cross-border aid mechanism in which areas, principally in northern Syria, that were not under the control of the Syrian government, but were under the control of Syrian rebels, would be able to receive aid across the border, mostly from Turkey. This is an innovation, let's say, in international law, because in general, you can't like invade a country to deliver aid. You need the consent of the country on whose territory you're operating. But in this case, the Assad government wasn't going to give its consent to give aid to starving populations in areas outside its control.
So there is some disagreement among international lawyers about this. There was an open letter from a bunch of international law scholars to the Secretary General, which essentially said that actually the Secretary General has the authority to move aid across borders, doesn't need approval from the Syrian government to do so. That's a controversial approach, but it is an open question.
Yeah.
Which is just to say that, like, multilateral aid, in theory, can move across borders for purely humanitarian purposes without government consent. And so that was an open question. It was something that people were encouraging the Secretary General to simply do because it's one of those airbud situations, which is that there's no rule that says the Secretary General cannot do this. So there are basically three big trends we see emerge from the Syrian civil war that we see through to today. The first of these is this effort by the elected members to separate the humanitarian and political portfolios and to move the levers of the UN system through the Security Council around humanitarian issues. The second is big innovations at the General Assembly about steps that the larger UN membership can take when the Security Council is gridlocked. The first of these is a set of innovations around what the obligations of the P5 are to the larger membership when they cast a veto. Having to go and explain the veto to the General Assembly, that's something that we see emerging from this conflict. The second big set of innovations is this idea that the General Assembly has things like investigative power. And so when the Security Council will refuse to act on a case, the General Assembly can do things like fund, in the Syrian case, the IIIM process, which essentially endeavors to collect prosecutorial level evidence on crimes against humanity, on war crimes, on crimes against the Syrian people, right? That is understood to be something that the General Assembly could do, even in the absence of Security Council agreement. We see both those mechanisms in play now in varying degrees in Ukraine and Gaza, two other places where the Security Council is gridlocked. The third set of things that we see emerging from this gridlock at the Security Council because of the Syrian civil war is much easier agreement on issues of counterterrorism and state stabilization than on multilateral peacekeeping. We haven't had essentially a new multilateral peacekeeping mission in 11 years now. What we have had is state stabilization missions and counterterrorism missions, things that the US and Russia agree to comparatively easily, even when they agree on nothing else. In fact, agree to in Syria itself.
And agreed to by designating the now de facto head of Syria as a terrorist.
Yeah.
He was a UN Security Council designated terrorist.
Yeah.
That was like one area, as you said, where they could agree.
And so as we see the decline in liberal multilateral peacekeeping, we see the rise of state stabilization and counterterrorism missions.
Yeah.
In Mali, in Cote d'Ivoire, today in Haiti, missions that the P5 can agree on easily. And critically, this is a place where we actually see the decline in liberal rhetoric, far predating what people talk about as being the sort of like rise of illiberalism in the big Western capitals, right? Because, these missions, and I'm thinking of John Carlsrud's work here, but like these missions to Cote d'Ivoire, to Mali, they have quite a bit of buy-in from what we think of as being traditionally good multilateral states, but really they present a real challenge for the UN model of intervention because they put the UN essentially in service of enforcing state violence. And that's a tricky position for the body to be in. And I'd say those are the three big trends that emerge out of this sort of gridlock.
And again, that's what makes this trip by the Security Council to Damascus, to Syria, such an important inflection point for the United Nations itself. I don't want to obviously take away the agency of Syrians here, but we're a podcast about the UN. We're talking about the significance of this trip to the UN itself. And for all the reasons you described, this is such an important moment for the UN. And to the last point you made, one, I think, of the key tasks of the Security Council over the next 24 hours in Damascus is to reestablish a modicum of trust between the Security Council and between the UN in general and the new Syrian authorities. I mean, for a number of reasons, the Shura government is probably not super excited or super willing to trust the Security Council or to trust the UN. I mean, if you look at how the UN conducted its aid operations in Syria, for example, the Assad regime was the Syrian government. It had to work with the Assad regime in order to manage the logistics of aid. And that could have been interpreted as like propping up the Assad regime.
Yeah.
But there were like obviously lots and lots of reasons for this, rebel group turned government to distrust the international system
Yeah.
as embodied by the UN after 11 years of civil war.
There are also lots of reasons for the average Syrian to distrust the United Nations. And, we've talked about this a lot over the course of, different episodes. But when we talk about who the UN actually is, the fact that the UN is a lot of different things, a lot of different bodies, we talked about the UN that talks and the UN that does, is to some extent a little less relevant in this particular case because the sort of ability of the UN that does to operate in ways that were completely independent of the Assad regime were, at the end of the day, pretty limited in some part by virtue of the choices that top leadership made. And I don't know how that is going to play with many Syrians.
And that kind of speaks to the future role of the UN in Syria. The UN could play a constructive role in Syria going forward. The UN is pretty good
Yeah.
at organizing elections, for example. It's pretty good at doing DDR,
Yeah.
demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. It's how, armed forces are folded into a national force. And right now, frankly, one of the big questions outstanding in Syria is what happens to the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is this mostly Kurdish force operating in northern parts of the country, and whether and how they might be integrated into the Syrian National Army. I don't think the UN is going to have much of a role in that just per se, but there are other kind of discrete aspects of like technical assistance that the UN could provide to Syria to help them in that transition from conflict to democracy. And, interestingly, I saw a senior Syrian official quoted at, right now the UN is looking and is searching in kind of like a secretive process for its next sort of special envoy for Syria. And the Syrians, they obviously like want someone they can work with. And I saw one quote by a senior Syrian official saying, we want a Latin American expert in transitions from dictatorship to democracy. So, yeah, so that's, very specific.
That's very specific and pretty wise.
Yeah.
There's like some chance that how old is Lakhdar Brahimi?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think he's pushing 90 at this point.
Nothing against 90-year-olds.
Yeah.
There's just a consistent stable of people that the UN often sends out.
Well, I mean, not to get too deep into the weeds here and go back too deep into history, but I just remember that in the early outset of the Syrian civil
Mhm.
war, it was recognized by the UN, by Ban Ki-moon to his credit,
Yeah.
that this was an explosive situation. And so he needed to bring out the A-team. So first he tapped Kofi Annan
Yep.
as like in the very early days as like the special envoy to try to help end this conflict before it exploded out of control. When Kofi Annan like resigned from that job, saying, he had like a peace plan he put forward,
Yeah.
the sides couldn't agree to it. Lakhdar Brahimi, another very international superstar, not, quite at the level of Kofi Annan and like an internationally, a world recognized figure, but people in our world know Lakhdar Brahimi, an Algerian diplomat, as like a diplomatic superstar. He was appointed. Then I think Stefan de Mistura of Italy was the next one after that. So it kind of went steadily down the famous people hierarchy to the point where the most recent one, Gary Peterson, nothing against him. He was just like not of the stature as, say, a Lakhdar Brahimi or a Kofi Annan. As the conflict ground on, less high profile people took on the impossible job of being the Syria envoy.
Yeah. It's interesting because on the one hand, like, it is comparatively logical that as they were unable to secure peace, they would resign from the post. But it's also the case that the less high profile these envoys became, the less clear it became that this was a key priority for the international community.
Yeah.
Again, nothing against the extremely committed later envoys. Just to say that you send someone out there, as you said at the beginning, to draw like big attention to the situation and to try to bring their reputation
Yeah.
to the line. But of course, it could be the case that Antonio Guterres was assessing that what was needed was not someone's reputation on the line, but someone who knew how to do like careful, slow negotiation and mediation.
Yeah.
The fact that Syrians are asking for someone with expertise on democratic traditions in Latin America indicates that what they want is not a moose head, but an expert, someone who knows what they're doing.
It's wild, like a year and a month ago, let's say in November of 2024, Syria was, it was just kind of, it had become background noise at the UN, at the Security Council. It was stuck.
Yeah.
And people like me and you, whose job it is to help like explain the world to people, I don't think we saw this coming.
No.
And it kind of just goes to show how sometimes unpredictable international affairs can be.
Yeah.
One last thing before we move on to our next segment, that the Security Council is also going to Lebanon in the coming days, where they will meet with the departing UNIFIL forces, which is the peacekeeping mission in southern Lebanon that is departing. I did not want to let that go without mention.
Yeah. And it is, again, a critical moment for them to determine what the shape of UN involvement in the region will be, particularly in face of the fact that there continued to be a lot of Israeli action in the area.
Yeah, and then frankly, this is also one of the key issues on the table for the Security Council in Syria, which is the fact that Israel still conducts strikes inside Syria, which is incredibly destabilizing for this fragile government.
Yeah.
So, we'll see where this all leads. It's after midnight in Damascus by the time we concluded this conversation. But again, such an important and crucial inflection point for the Security Council, for the United Nations in general. Syria today, it's one of the hopeful spots on the map. And so, hopefully the UN can do what it can to support Syria in its transition. And hopefully this meeting in Damascus today will clarify some of that.
Yeah, it's actually my birthday on the 4th, so we'll hope that brings them luck.
Oh, happy birthday to you.
Thank you. Early, it's tomorrow. Tomorrow here,
Let's
today
hear
in
birthday
Damascus. That's right, it's my birthday in Damascus.
Happy birthday to you, Anjali.
Thank you.
So for your birthday, I hope that regular listeners of this show become paying subscribers so they can hear the rest of your thoughts on the rest of the topics that we have to discuss today. And they can do so by going to the show notes of this episode. And if they want to support at full price, they can just go to globaldispatches.org. If you want to support our work at a discount, totally fine. Love you. Any way we can get you, go to globaldispatches.org/40% off. And that's the word %. Please click on subscribe to keep listening. And what are we going to discuss after the fold, Anjali?
We are going to talk about budget cuts at the UN. What else? And a sort of early preview of the Secretary General's race again.
Yeah, I would say that this week we saw the pre-launch of the race to replace Antonio Guterres, and we'll discuss what that means after the jump for all you UN nerds. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Save Us from Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us from Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.